video this week that anyone really liked, stuck out to them. Especially everybody. I love the story of Joseph. I love Old Testament stories. R.C. Sproul's really good at telling stories, so I really enjoyed listening to it. But is there just anything that maybe, part of the story? There were parts of the story, like that's one of the first ones you read when you're little. They go through it. But there were so many parts that I'd forgotten, really. And I mean, I've not done it long. I think we did Genesis with the teen class not long ago, and I remember doing that story. I'd forgotten so many of the little pieces when you think about it. I totally forgot about the guy. He's like, hey, remember me when you get out of prison, and the guy forgot about him. That's the way it goes. Or maybe he didn't forget, or he's like, I ain't bringing you up before the Pharaoh. I don't know you, I don't know, but I'd forgot all about that point, and things like that. So it's really good to hear it again. And it really is a perfect example of God's providence. And as we think about it, and as you think about God's providence, when we're talking about it, we're talking about the way that God governs all things every moment of our lives. You understand there's no idle time with God. There's no time or anything that's happening that is out of his control. As I was reading, I was looking into other books and things that R.C. Sproul kind of written on the topic, and he's got this book called The Essentials of Christian Faith, and it's really good points where he talks about different things. And one of the things he says is anytime that we render in our own minds God out of control, we make him a bystander or a cheerleader that simply roots for us to do well and celebrates our victories and is crushed by our defeats, right? We know God, Psalms tells us that he's in heaven and he's never frustrated. His plans are never frustrated. So I want you to think about that. I'm frustrated on a daily basis, okay? If you've got kids and you're probably frustrated on a daily basis. I want you to think about all of the plans you make, all the things you hope to do, how frustrating they are, and how often they go awry. With God, it's never like that. Not a moment. There's never been a moment in the history of the universe. Of course, he exists outside of time, but never a moment where he's been frustrated that something's not worked out the way that he's wanted it to. I want you to think about that. And so the verse we'll start with today that I wanted to kind of talk about is just Psalm 52, if you want to turn there with me. This psalm, David wrote it when he was hiding from Saul. If you think it's kind of similar to the story of Joseph, things are not good. He is out in the wilderness. He's hiding. Saul's trying to kill him. And this is what he writes. Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me. For in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge. Until the storms of destruction pass by, I cry out to God Most High, to the God who fulfills his purpose for me. I think that's important to remember, right? Okay, it's God who fulfills the purpose for you. Okay, not you. Not you. Okay, we can plan and we can do, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with planning. And we'll talk about that. The whole purpose to talk about providence is not to scare you into never plan again. Just sit on your hands and hide in a closet and wait for that. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, what we're talking about is when you go to look and plan and do things, never get the idea that you are the final factor in what takes place. Right? That's just the truth. R.C. Sproul was saying, men plan. This is the way it is with us. We plan and say, I will go and do this, and I will do this. And 20 years from now, I want to be here. And 5 years from now, I want to be here. And then we scatter like ants and work tirelessly to try to make it happen. And often it never happens the way we want it to or expected it to. When God declares a thing to happen, it happens. And so everything, all our purposes and everything that we want to accomplish and the things we hope to accomplish are really accomplished by God's will and what he allows to happen. Everything, every moment. Your being here today is an act of God's providence. The fact that you woke up this morning is God's providence. The fact that you made it here this morning without some time, and you may have, some of you like with kids, if you're like me, it's not been easy. But if you've gotten here this morning without any trouble, without anything happening, that's not God's providence. And that's what we're talking about today. And that's what I want to make sure that we understand. Really. Now, the specific lesson was titled The Mystery of God's Providence, which is wonderful when you open up to teach something and it's a mystery. Okay. So it's kind of oxymoronic. But what we want to talk about is when God brings things about, and we know that he does. As Noah talked last week about God being in control. We know he does, but we will never fully understand the reasons why he does it the way he does it. That's the truth. Like there's no, like if you were hoping I'd come give you an answer on that, I can't. It's not going to happen. Right? I can't sit here and explain and understand all of the motives and the reason things are happening to you right now. And the truth is, people shouldn't be trying to do that anyway. But today in the church, it's very common for people to do that. People want to try to tell you and discern every point of God's will and every event that's happening in your life. If you think back to the story with Job, remember bad things were happening to Job. Job didn't know why. And here come all his friends to tell him why. Right? And every single one of them are wrong. Well, it's because of this, Job. It's because of this. You should do this. You should do this. You should do this. And that's the way it is today. How many people you can turn on TV and they're trying to discern the signs of the times and what's happening? Well, God's allowed this to happen. This is why. Because so-and-so's been bad. Because this has happened. Right? What happened yesterday is a great example of that. Right? You can turn on any news station and there's thousands of people trying to tell you what has happened. What's going on. The government planned it. The CIA did it. It was the left. It was the right. It was his own people. It was this. And none of them really know. That's the truth. Christian TBN and other churches, they're talking about this, signs of the times, revelations. They're talking about, they don't know. And R.C. Sproul said it best, to try to understand God's declarative, private, sovereign will is an invasion of his privacy. Right? That he does not owe you. That he does not owe any of us. Never anywhere does it ever say, I'm going to tell you everything I'm going to do and why I'm doing it so you know all the time. Never. Right? Never at any point. Verse isn't it that? Okay. Now, so I do want to talk about it when we talk about God's will specifically in providence. God's will, what he wants to happen, providence, him bringing it about and governing it. There's really three types, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it. Because we'd probably be here all day, and I'm probably not the best to just discuss it openly, constant, like in long amounts of time. So if you got questions, Noah can do a dissertation on that next Sunday. But the three I want to talk about that were mentioned in R.C. Sproul's book, the essentials of the Christian faith, are just three simple ones, and I'm sure they can branch out, be more specific. But they're three really, really easy ones, and it's the creative will, his perceptive will, and his permissive will. Okay. And when we talk about the wills of God, are the way that he goes about things happening, right? His creative will is any time that he decrees something to be. Okay. We see this in the Bible, specifically in Genesis, right? Let there be light. It happens. Okay. He creates the planet with just speaking of his voice. He decrees something to happen. It is going to happen. That's just a creative will. Okay. The perceptive will is think about things like the Ten Commandments, the commandments you're given. Anytime that he allows us to know his will through his laws, his covenants, and things like that. And then lastly, and this is the one we want to talk about today specifically with Joseph. Okay, and if anyone has anything to add about this, is just the super summary. If anyone has anything to add, please add. It's the permissive will of God. Okay, and the permissive will of God is God's will where he allows things to happen or permits them to happen by his will. Okay. And we talked about that with Sproul. What was the last verse? Pretty much he goes over in the story. We all know it. The point with the brothers. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. Right? That's his permissive will. He allowed these things to happen. He permitted them to happen. Okay, for good, though your intentions were evil. And there's no wrong in God for that. That's what we have to make sure that we understand. God is never wrong for permitting bad to happen. Okay? All right. Does anyone have anything to add about that? Please.
cross too. It was
Mhm.
treated. Right?
Yeah.
Yet also, he is working sovereignly in all things.
Mm-hmm.
And through the evil choices and wickedness of men, he's still sovereign and governing all of that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't understand just like all of it, how it all works, but he is working his plan for his sovereign purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So Acts 2, Acts 4 talks about that
Mm-hmm.
there at the cross.
Yeah. Yeah. And to think about, specifically we're talking about what happens with Joseph in the story, but think about all who benefited outside of that, who were even pagan, right? All of Egypt was fed. Millions of people were saved by what God chose to do in Joseph. They weren't even Hebrews. They didn't even believe in God, right? And that's the last part. He chose to happen so that many would be saved. You can talk about all the meanings about all that be saved. Not only the Hebrews, what will come because they survived, the nation of Israel that'll happen, what they get the land of Goshen. When you read into Exodus, they multiply greatly. They're enslaved again. Then Moses leads them out, right? And then you have the nation of Israel. You still got to be thinking at this point, Abraham's been promised there'll be a great nation. Jacob's been promised. There's only 12 of them. You know what I mean? That's a long way off when you think about it. But from this story is really a pivotal point of God creating that nation, of fulfilling his promise of everything, even though they're enslaved again. It's a long jump from 12 to a nation, right? Although I'm sure if you raise 12 kids in a household, it'd feel like a nation when you think about it. But
one more, just Psalm 105, which is really interesting. Verse 17. He sent a man before him, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet. So the brothers are wickedly, obviously involved in jealousy against their brother and sending him out. And yet, what does the psalmist say? It was the Lord.
Yeah.
Ultimately, who sent him ahead to save him.
And it's so important to think about the language used. And Piper talked about this in one point he wrote the book Providence, and I've pulled some stuff from that. But the language we often think and that's been used today is a twisting, right? That is, you meant it for bad. God meant it. Yes, it was supposed to happen. Okay, like there's this idea that people do bad things, and God takes it and turns it and makes it good. Like he's reacting to things that happen. Like, oh, I didn't plan on that. I'll take it and fix that. That's not what's happening at all. Everything bad that happened to Joseph was meant to happen. And while the brother's intention was evil and wicked, God's intention was good in allowing it to happen. Does that make sense? It's not something he's reacting to. We're going to read more verses on that. I just want to lead up to that and talk about the permissive will of God and him allowing things to happen, right? And so Dave, if you got anything.
His response on that, it's interesting, his response to his brothers in that verse 2, because, life comes at us with great, great challenges. And in this case, Joseph went through years of prison and appeared to be injustices, all those things. And so what's the tendency humanly? You're bitter, you're frustrated, it's overwhelming. Why? You're giving up on God's good providence or his goodness at all. But yet Joseph, and again, this is God working in Joseph. Look at it, his response to his brothers is amazing there in verse 21 of chapter 50. Do not fear of his brothers who recognize they deserved punishment, right? No graces. And then he goes on, I will provide for you and your little ones. Then he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So the providence of God, Joseph was very aware of and embraced that, accepted that, and then rejoiced in what God had done to save many people, to be kept alive through that means. And what a miracle. That's a miracle of God in our lives when you go through these kind of things. And you see his providence and then see his response. That's his heart now. Because he knew God was good and he had good purposes. And that's may the Lord help us all in all of our circumstances to come to those
And I don't think we realized, I think the whole episode with Joseph, especially with prison and everything, I think it lasted, if I remember trying to read it right, I may be off a little bit, but 22 years. I want you to think about that. 22 years. Okay. Like, where were you 22 years ago? You think about that. Like, I was 6. Okay. That's a huge point. Like, we struggle when we go through a week, right, of difficulties. We're like, what is the reasoning for this? How will I ever make it out? 22 years, right, of trusting in God's providence, right, and seeing where this was not like something that he went through he had rough teenage years. He had bad high school experience. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a major chunk of his life, of this hardship, probably his prime years, when you think about it. I mean, he was a young boy, right, of the 12 sons when he was taken and sold. It's not like he was an old guy. It was, Uncle Joseph, right, at the time. He was young, right? That, talked about him as a slave. Even Sproul talked about it. He was a strong, handsome young man. Potiphar's wife liked him. These were the prime years of his life that he spent in prison and tribulation. I want you to think about that. And as you said, to come out the other end, Dave, it's amazing to come out in totally embrace of God's providence. And that's the way we have to be. And I think that's really the idea that we want, as we talk about providence, to come out leaning into, fully committed to the idea of God's providence in all things, good and bad, right, at all times. And really, if I was to think, as we teach, what do we want everybody to leave here with? It's that we understand in the hardest moments of our life, God is working and for our good.
To David's point, I've read Joseph a lot of times, and I always thought about how God works. If he would have met his brothers a year later, would it have been the same reaction that God conditioned him over those 22 years or whatever, and just strengthened him and grew him? And when it was ready, that's providence, isn't it? The whole thing.
Yeah. Yes, and everything that happens, and including human actions. And I think when we talk in the church today, a lot of people have no problem with God's providence over Satan, God's providence over disease, God's providence over your poverty, right? But when you start talking about God's providence over human decision and the things that happen, all of a sudden people kind of freak out. But it's really almost comical to think about. We're good with him having all spiritual providence and financial providence and healing providence in all points of our life. But the idea that he has control even over the decisions of the wicked sometimes takes us back. But how can he be God over everything but human decision? When you think about it, right? He wouldn't be God. And R.C. Sproul wrote this when he talked about specifically, okay, when God is reduced to the role of a spectator, cheerleader, by which God's exercise in providence is that of a helpless father having done all he can do, we must now sit back and simply hope for the best. He permits, but he cannot help. He permits over his sovereign power. He permits, but has no sovereign power. This ghastly view is not merely a defective view, but it is really unvarnished atheism. That's really what it comes out to when you say that. When you say God is helpless to act and to do, you're, a deist at best, really, as R.C. Sproul calls it. It's atheism. I mean, really deep down, if God has no control and is not able to help, he's really not God. Okay? And I really think that's sometimes hard for people to hear when you talk about it, but that's the slope that you're on when you start talking about what God can't do or what he doesn't have power over. So there's a couple verses and things I want to get some of us to read here to talk about. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that another factor in that Steve Lawson said was God has never looked into the future and learned any.
Yeah, absolutely.
So because part of that thought for so many people is God seeing this thing happening and going, oh no, what can we do? I need to come up with a plan B or C or D.
Yeah.
None of that. He's never looked into the future and learned any.
Yeah. No, right. Because I remember that because I think he said, right, for that to be true, God would have to not know something. Right. And then he's not all knowing. Right.
How can God not be sovereign and not know everything?
I know. Yeah, absolutely.
And omniscient.
Yeah.
So is it Graham Goldsworthy? Is that guy's name?
Yeah.
Who said the ultimate purpose of God is not Adam and Eve in the garden, but Jesus on the cross?
Hmm.
So that
Yeah,
was not plan B. That was not him looking to the future.
Absolutely.
No, that didn't go right.
Yeah.
So I'm
What
going to
is-
send Jesus.
yeah. Well, and what does the verse say? Right from the foundation of the earth, right? You know, from the very creation, that was the purpose. A couple verses I want us to read. If we'll turn to just James 4:13 through 17, as we talk about God being in control of just daily actions and providence in everyday life. What he talks about. I remember this verse from a while back, and I've always thought about it. So it's James chapter 4, starting in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and we will do this or that. Right? Again, it's not a warning against planning. It's a warning against the type of thinking that fully believes that you control or the decisive factor in what happens day in and day out of your life. You're not. Right? This isn't the Old Testament either. I mean, this is James talking in the New Testament. Right? Don't sit here and think for a minute, right, that you are in control of everything that's going to happen. I'll tell this story real quick. I remember I spent months and months and months doing a fundraiser for a sports team I was coaching. We were doing like a pickleball tournament, and we were indoors in our big nice rec facility. And I'd probably spent, I don't know how much time. And we get out there, we're about to get started. A storm blows out of nowhere, and the power cuts off. Nothing to the building. And I'm frantic, running around calling everybody. I'm calling Dad. I'm upset. And I remember just losing my mind constantly. And I remember he said something that, reading that verse, he said, what do you want me to do? Stop the storm? And right, but in truth, of all the things, I thought there is no way that anything to an indoor event at this huge, nice facility could ever happen. And boy, was I wrong, right? But it's that way. But God's like, don't ever think that anything that happens good to you is a mercy, is a blessing from me. You didn't come about it of yourself.
Yeah, I read somewhere one time that if it's not God's will, you can't make it happen. If it is God's will, you can't stop it.
Yeah. And so there's lots of verses. So I'm going to split up some verses here if you don't mind reading. Michael, do you mind reading Proverbs 16, verse 9?
Sure.
Boo, do you mind reading Proverbs 20, verse 24? Then Dave, do you mind reading Jeremiah 10, 23?
Can I just share something quickly?
Yes.
So when I was going through the worst circumstances of my life, and I'm 42 years old, and I was in a ton of counseling, support groups, doing it all. I had a devotional book, and at the time, the big word was codependency. You would learn all that. So it was a devotional book that codependency was kind of a theme. And I get up this morning, I open it, I read one for the day, and the first line said, "Control is an illusion." And it was like I got hit by a 2x4. Because there's part of us that are, me for sure, that just still thinks I can control some things. And my life was so totally out of control, and even with all of that, just control is an illusion. And that's been a huge thing for me to remember that. It's God that's in control. And, like James says, hold all things loosely.
Mm-hmm.
And for God to be sovereign, that's the characteristic of him that is most important.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, I mean, in the end, that's what gives you some semblance of comfort. If it was left in your hands, it would be a rough time. I mean, that's just the truth. I mean, that's the way people really need to think about it. It's not that God wields over you like a tyrant. It's the fact that he's saving you really from yourself. And anyone in here who's been saved, but you've been saved from your sin, your decisions, your issues, right? That's just the truth of the matter.
He said in the video, over the treachery of man is the goodness of God.
Mhm.
I love that.
Absolutely. Noah, do you mind reading Proverbs 19:21? David, did you get Jeremiah 10:23? Okay, and then the last one, Dad, can you read Proverbs 21:1? All right, we'll go. Michael, do you want to go first?
16 verse 9.
Mm-hmm.
The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps.
Boo, you can go ahead.
So which one am I doing?
Proverbs 20, verse 24.
A man's steps are from the Lord. How then can man understand his way?
Dave.
Jeremiah 10:23. I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not in man who walks to direct his steps.
Then Noah.
Many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand.
And then Dad.
The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will.
Yeah, so in all people, right? All men, you get this general sense, especially in Proverbs, that for every man, I like the last one with the king, right? Even the rulers and the kings. And I think about what happened yesterday as we talk about it. Like, God is not a bystander, even in that. For whatever purpose that he's bringing about, whatever we may not know or understand, but we know he's directly involved, and I'm thankful that, he wasn't killed, But the idea, I think it's funny, the idea that leadership is separate from God is foolish. The idea, if you're dependent on man to save you, if you think leadership is not ordained by God and placed there by who he wants for whatever reason or purpose, right, you're mistaken. And so I think, thinking about yesterday, and I don't know Trump personally or know anything about him, but I'm sure he wrote in thinking, what a wonderful rally this will be. It'll be great. And 10 minutes into it, we realize what little control even the former president of the United States has over anything. I mean, think about that. I mean, I'm not, talking about anything other than just saying no matter how rich or powerful, whatever standing you have in this life, no man has that control.
Well, even just what you're talking about, you think about from the shooter's perspective, him planning that bullet to go straight where he wanted it to go, and yet by God's providence, it misses
Yeah.
even by inches.
Mm-hmm.
Things like man plans and God is the one who directs.
Yeah.
It just makes me think of the other side.
Yeah. And then, even in those, we're just talking about general, but even in the bad. And so we'll read these. I'll read these real quick. So in 1 Peter, if y'all want to turn there, because there'll be 2 verses from there. 1 Peter 4:19, and then I'll read 1 Peter 3:17. So 1 Peter 4, verse 19, therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. And then 1 Peter 3:17, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if that it should be God's will, than for doing evil, right? Sometimes God wills his people to suffer. And I think about, you were talking about that bullet missed Trump, but I remember reading that there was actually a bystander killed there. And to think about that the bullet missed him and hit that poor member of someone's family, whether it be a father, mother, daughter, I don't know. I didn't read into the details, but that's awful. And to think about, God is sovereign over the good and the bad. And while for Trump, he probably says, thank you, Lord, as he should, I can't imagine what the family of the member who just showed up there, who wasn't it, what they're feeling to say. But God was sovereign in that action as well, always. And Noah, you made a good point that I really enjoyed hearing the other day when you said God doesn't need us to get him off the hook when we explain and talk about this to people. We don't have to say, well, there's a better part. If it happened, God meant it to happen. And he doesn't need us to get him off the hook for that, or to try to explain, well, he's still good, or sometimes this happens, or, he sees far out, God's good. He's sovereign, and whatever he ordains to happen is what is supposed to happen. And we need to remember that. Yes, Troy?
I just wanted to share a blessing to me this morning. I was coming to church and heard a song, basically talking about praising God for the answers that haven't come yet. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, if I wait till God answers to praise Him, I'm liable to bust a blood vessel praising Him. So, we should be praising for the answers that haven't come yet, because we know by His sovereignty they will.
And the best verse to talking about of how, Bill, you mentioned it in Acts 4, we'll read it if you want to turn to Acts 4, 27 and 28. So we talk about how things, even when men mean evil, God allows them to happen for good. The same way. And so Acts 4, 27, 28. All right. For truly in this city there were gathered against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. I want you to think about that. Like nobody's left out there. Okay? The Israelites, the Romans with Pilate, Herod, and the Israelites, you all, every one of you, every person in this collective group that was gathered in that city that day acted at what was predestined to happen. The exact way it was told to happen, the exact way He made it come about, it happened. Right? And thank God that it happened. I want you to think about that. I mean, as bad as that is, as hard as a moment that is, the idea of the death of Jesus, His betrayal by Judas and everything, to bring about what? Our salvation. Right? And it leaves you thinking the same thing that Joseph said, what they meant for evil, God, you meant for good. Right? So that what? So that many could be saved. I mean, that's just the truth. So we got a little bit of time. Does anything have anything to add?
I think you made a good point that video as well, or audio, that He didn't whitewash the evil either.
Mm-hmm.
You meant evil.
Yeah.
You did mean evil, and so that under God's sovereignty, and He is universally and eternally higher than any of our decisions. There's still decisions, and recognizing the importance of decisions, and submitting our lives and our will to the Lord, and recognizing there's an accountability there, and even in a sense, for those who do evil against us, we're to, of course, forgive them, but God will. There will be justice. Right? If they're not under the blood, then we can release that to Him too, right? And still continue to be gracious and kind. Lord He will be just. Yeah. And so you don't have to have revenge. We have the Lord.
Well, and like what he said, and can't remember if it's Piper or Sproul that said it, it's almost a veiled threat when they say, have mercy on us, and he says, am I in the place of God? Right? Like God will deal with you. Right? Like I'm not saying I can't speak for Him and what He will choose to do with you and what will happen from around, but I'm not His place. That's exactly what that means. I mean, that should almost be more fearful than a threat from Him, right? I'm not His place. I can't tell you. But you need to understand is however He decides to handle it, He'll handle it. But to think about, I'll come back to you in just a minute, Sarah. But to think about, just before we end, what I liked about Sproul was as he went through every small detail that happened and how important it was to this intricate story. I mean, from a coat, from a Technicolor coat, right? And some jealous brothers, right? Then he talked about the dream, right? He comes out and he's like, could you think what younger brother would be foolish enough to share that? Hey, I just had this dream from the Lord, and guess what? You're all my servants, right? If that's not the dream of every younger sibling ever, right? Like every younger sibling has that dream. But to think about that, even that, to end up in prison with a man who's just going to fortuitously end up at Pharaoh's court, of all the people who could have bought him, I mean, he could have been bought and sent to a mine, to some hard labor where he'd never make it out, but instead Potiphar buys him, of all people. And then the task that he gives, God allows them to flourish so that he can move up in Potiphar's household. And think about that, only to be thrown in prison, right? Only to rise, to fall, to rise, to fall. I mean, that's been like the story of his life. Things go great, then they're taken away. Then he rises again, thrown in prison. And you think all along Joseph has to be thinking, what is going on? Why? Why bless all that I do in Potiphar's house just to have me thrown in prison? Right? And to think, and I'm not saying you got to be against planning. Again, I want to make that fact clear. I'm sure Joseph was trying to get out of prison. I'm sure he was working and petitioning people, and not wrongly, but I'm sure he wasn't just sitting there waiting, something will happen. Hey, when you go to Pharaoh's court, remember me, put in a good word for him. I mean, he was trying all that he can do, right? But the idea is like, God is working at all points. There was never a moment in that story, in even the smallest tidbit of information, that God wasn't using to bring about his purposes. And his purposes are good. And the theme of the lesson, the whole point, will you ever understand why he chooses to do it the way he does it? No. But I promise you couldn't do it better. I promise you couldn't do it better. I mean, read these stories. Who would ever think to bring it about this way?
That's how you know it was God.
Absolutely. And I think about points, I'll come back to you, but think about points in your life of every moment of how you've got, think of all the small incidents that's ever happened that led you to this point, right? Nothing is happening coincidentally, by coincidence. Yes, Boo.
So at Noah Hilton's service, there was so much that was poignant and powerful. One of them was the last person to speak was a young man who's now a math teacher who had been the leader of a Bible study group when Noah, I think, was 7th, 8th grade. And the two of them were still texting. And this guy started reading texts that Noah had sent him recently. And one of them said, sometimes I want to throw up my hands to God and say, why? And he said, but all that matters is that we know that we're called according to his purpose and he works all things for good. And to be sitting in that service and to hear that from Noah's journal, from that text, that's just, his understanding was just powerful as all that was about to happen.
Amen. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll pray for us, guys, and we'll close. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we're just so thankful for your providence, how you care for your people, Father. It's not our place to question, it's our place to understand, but Father, to trust that you are good, Father, and know, Father, that you care for your people, Father, and how you've cared for us to bring about our salvation, Father. We continue to grow us and sanctify us, Father. I pray that as we go into the service, Father, that be in the front of our minds as we worship, that you are good, Father. And I pray that that you just bless the sermon, Father, and that you just bless the entire service, Father. May we hear your words with humble hearts. And Father, may we never forget all that you have done for us. In your name we pray. Amen.